Although the bill has its first reading in the House of Assembly that same day, it's over 2 months before the second reading debate commences in November. It's impossible to predict how some of the members will vote. Edward Hawker is worth watching. His father, George, presented the petition in favour of votes for women and is a staunch supporter. Edward, however, is more conservative and almost always votes against Kingston's policies. But he supported the second reading of last year's suffrage bill and even argued that if women could vote, they should also be allowed to sit. He voted against the third reading, but only, he said, because it included a referendum. The hardest to predict is Sir John Downer. He opposes much of Kingston's legislation, but has always advocated for women's suffrage. On the day the second reading debate begins, George Riddoch presents a petition signed by 2,000 women against women's suffrage.
The Minister for Education.
Mr Speaker, it is now over 10 years since this measure first came before the House. Upon this question there is no doubt, even in the minds of opponents, as to what the settlement of this question must eventually be. The only point is as to how long it should be delayed. The time is undoubtedly right for this great reform, and women should no longer be denied the privilege sought. Wherever the suffrage has been granted, it has proved to be beneficial. In Wyoming, it has been tried for a quarter of a century and generally has been most beneficial. Then let us look at New Zealand, which has recently granted the franchise to women. The election was a very interesting one. Female voters were in no way molested, and canvassing was carried on by the female electors with considerable energy in many places. The results which have been gained in New Zealand should encourage us to adopt the system here. Mr Speaker, we have had various petitions before us against the bill and for. The largest that was presented by the Honourable G.C. Hawker, which has 11,000 signatures and is in favour of the suffrage. Most of the petitions on the other side have comparatively fewer signatures. The largest being that presented by Mr Riddoch here today, which bears 2,000 signatures.
Order! The honourable member is entitled to be heard in silence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The first reason given against the bill is because the suffrage is to be regarded not as a privilege to be enjoyed, but as a duty to be performed, which duty we do not want thrust upon us. Yes. Is it seriously contended that a majority of the women in South Australia do not wish to perform their duty? Surely this is not the case. Not true. The second reason given is because the household, not the individual, is the unit of the state, and the vast majority of women are represented by household suffrage. Even if the vast majority of women are represented by household suffrage, why should not all have such liberty? The petition goes on to say, Because the energies of women are engrossed by their present duties and interests from which men cannot relieve them. It was never contemplated that women should leave her present interests and duties. She can exercise the franchise without doing so. It is not intended that women should leave their household duties, their cradle and kitchen, and plunge into politics any more than it is necessary for men to abandon their farm or business because they record their vote. The petition also says, because political equality will deprive women of special privileges hitherto enjoyed by their sex, this is the common threat that men would withdraw their chivalry if women went to the polls. It would be a good thing if such cheap and false chivalry were abolished. Then it says, because suffrage logically involves the holding of public office, which is inconsistent with the duties of most women. It does not involve anything of the sort, and it does not mean that they would take a seat in the legislature. Although the bill places women on entirely the same footing as men, members have no cause to fear their monopoly in this respect.
What reason have you got to keep them from here?
No reason, except that they do not want to come. All they want is to have a voice in electing those who make the laws by which they are governed equally with men. Mr. Speaker, it has been urged that a large number of women do not desire the right to vote. But it is not a question of that number, of this number, requiring it. It is a question of the requirements of the state. And in order to ascertain whether the requirements of the state demand this, I hope you will excuse me if I mention 2 or 3 salient points in temperament and mental characteristics in which women differ from men. Women are not given to philosophic speculation. Women are impressed by immediate facts and are always disposed towards a wholesome realism and do not indulge in abstract theories. None of these points disqualify women from exercising the franchise, but if anything, it presents them in a favourable light, because legislators have to deal with actual fact and not with abstract disquisitions. There is another respect in which men and women differ constitutionally. In man's nature, there is greater variability.
In some.
I was speaking of man as a sex and not as an individual. Men are more erratic. For this reason, genius is more frequently met with among men. But though this variability sometimes leads to brilliant and startling results, it also leads to innumerable worthless and harmful deviations. Neither genius or idiosyncrasy are necessary in the exercise of the franchise, and the more equable and common-sense disposition of women subjects them to no disadvantage in this respect. Then we are told that it is not the province of women. It is frequently said that home is the only province and sphere of woman. Our laws surround the home with a network which has an intimate influence upon it, and is therefore of no use saying that home is a woman's sphere if we deny her a voice in saying what should be the conditions surrounding and vitally affecting the home. Mr. Speaker, I ask members to look through various matters which come before this House and to note how many things there are which essentially concern woman, and in which she would be just as qualified to pronounce a sound judgment as a man. I can call to mind several cases in which women are proprietors, in some instances managers of factories, and have a number of employees under them. It does seem ridiculous that the owner, the mistress of an establishment, should have no voice in matters concerning her so deeply, whilst every adult male working for her, whose interest is not so great, can go and record his vote.
Absolutely.
There is not an argument which can be advanced in favour of representative government which does not apply with equal force to the extension of the franchise to women. How can it be said that the people are self-governed and about half of the whole adult population are excluded from having a voice in the affairs of the state? I hold in my hand a circular in which several reasons are given for supporting a measure of this description. They are as follows. 1, because it is the foundation of all political liberty that those who obey the law should be able to have a voice in choosing those who make the law. Because Parliament should be a reflection of the wishes of the people. Because Parliament cannot fully reflect the wishes of the people when the wishes of women are without any direct representation. Because a government of the people, by the people and for the people should mean all of the people and not one half. Because most of the laws affect women as much as men. These are all self-evident propositions. It is one of the most fundamental principles that in a free country where people govern themselves, it is absolutely necessary that no portion of the adult population should be withheld from the exercise of the franchise. What are the qualities necessary for the exercise of the franchise?
Common sense.
That it is not a prerogative of man alone. Woman has more knowledge than man about active affairs. Men are very fond of talking and are better at fighting. But the real administration of affairs cannot be said to be outside the function of woman. Does not the honourable member know that no Frenchman takes any important step without consulting the women of the household, especially his mother? It might sound ridiculous to honourable members, but it is a fact nonetheless.
Suppose he has a grandmother.
In this matter, South Australia does not, as she has done in other matters, lead the way, but she might well follow a good example. The reform is inevitable. Let us invite the future by boldly embarking on this course, not waiting till we are overwhelmed by the advancing tide of public opinion. And if we seek for other reward than the consciousness of right action, it would be something to live in the grateful memory of the women of South Australia.
Order! I call on Mr. Gilbert.
Mr. Speaker, woman in her sphere is the noblest of human beings, but I object to any attempt to remove her from her sphere. The influence of woman on the home is very great. It has well been admitted that in the family their influence is greatest. Yes. We should therefore be very careful lest we do anything that would destroy the family. Upon the home, life, the welfare of the nation depends. Man and woman are made one by marriage, but now it is proposed to make two of them. They are not to be one, but two in social and political matters. And is that right? No. Certainly not. Not at all. Mr. Speaker, the vote should not be entrusted to those who are imperfectly educated on political questions. If it is necessary for men to look at political subjects carefully before exercising their vote, surely it is needful for women to have some political training before such a privilege is granted to them. Can she afford that time, which is necessary to read and cultivate an acquaintance with politics, and at the same time do justice to her home duties? When they have such a beautiful condition of things, I suppose Mr. Price may stay at home to nurse the baby, and Mrs. Price would come to the house. It appears to me that we cannot stop at simply giving women the franchise, because if she has all the grand qualifications ascribed to her by the minister, we must work it out to a logical sequence and give her a seat in the legislature. Would the minister support the bill its entirety and give her place?
What a ridiculous thing.
Is it not the extremists who are making all the fuss about adult suffrage? Another point is that the minister has given no facts or data by which the necessity of the thing is proved. He has not shown what existing difficulties, abuses it, would remedy. It would be a mistake to go in for such a remedy till its necessity has arisen. We have one of the most liberal constitutions in the world. And what need is there for this fad, which would only destroy the peace and prosperity of the state?
The House will come to order, and I call on Mr. Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I regard this question as one of supreme importance and worthy of our most earnest consideration. For it is not a question of mushroom growth, but one which has been gaining in strength during the last century. No reform has been asked for so quietly and so persistently. No other reform has been urged on such just and reasonable grounds. And no reform would provide and prove so widespread and beneficial in its effects. It must strike every fair-thinking man that the arguments of the opponents of this measure are, when not purely sentimental, purely selfish, and are based on the belief that absolute might means absolute right. There is a great difference of opinion as to whether women really desire the franchise, but that a large number do desire it. We have evidence in the large petitions numbering some thousands asking for it. And we also have evidence by petition that some do not desire it. My reply to them is, do not use it. It is not compulsory. But supposing for the sake of the argument the majority were indifferent, though if this bill is carried, I have no doubt that would prove incorrect, surely that would not be a fair reason for not extending the franchise to them, or a good reason for not giving them the same liberty of action to one half of the community which is extended to the other. The chief difficulties in the way of the extension of the franchise to women are not arguments based on logical reasoning, but grounds of popular sentiment, which more than anything else relegate her to the absurd and unjust position she has occupied in the past, and has tended to slow the development of her mental faculties and prevent her taking the position which she could justly claim, and which I am persuaded she will soon receive. Mr. Speaker, ideas with regard to woman and her sphere have gradually changed during the century and are still changing, as is seen in the trend of modern thought, the outcome of which in the near future will make us wonder at our ignorance and short-sightedness in the day when we thought her unworthy to share our deliberations and asked her quietly to take a back seat in every matter but bringing children into the world, which we kindly allow her to do at your behest, not being desirous to undertake it ourselves. I would like to ask opponents which they think more likely to disturb the harmony of domestic life: women's vote or men's vice? Surely arguments arguments which dwell upon the preservation of women's purity and delicacy and refinement are rather an anomaly, seeing that men and not voting deprive her of these every day. It is absurd to argue that the vote will be antagonistic to men. Women are not going to band themselves together to legislate for men or in opposition to men and relegate men to the position in which we have unjustly kept women. Rather, she would join, yes, unjustly, rather she would join with men in helping to a juster and fuller legislation, a legislation which can never be complete while one half of the community forces the other into acquiescence with its will. Mr. Speaker, I think looking carefully at the moral, social and financial position of the world at large, and South Australia in particular, that we must admit there is nothing so brilliant in the present state of affairs that we may justly conclude that we have been working constitutionally on the only sound and possible foundation, or that all the wisdom is confined to the sex who have hitherto had the governing power. This contemplation ought to make us seriously consider whether the unsolved social problems, the extremes of wealth and poverty, the misery, the sin, the want, the discontent, the spirit of anarchy which meets us on every hand might have some root in the fact that men have had the monopoly in legislation that half the nation have been forced to silence. Oh, you've always got something to say, haven't you? For the sake of our sons and daughters, for the sake of the great social fabric of the world, for the sake of justice and right, let us break this silence and frankly admit when we see our political life lifted to a higher elevation and loftier standard, and while our whole social environment is then purified and raised, that we have only swept away an injustice too long existing. And crave the pardon of womankind that not until 1894 had we placed her in the true and right position.
Order. The chair acknowledges Mr. Poynton.
Mr. Speaker, I cannot conceive of anything more selfish or more positively mean than to make woman subject and amenable to all the laws that bigoted man has made, and yet Solomon over there is a great example of a bigoted man, and having done that, they yet refuse her the right of having some say in the selection of those who are to make and administer the laws she has to live under. I have no sympathy for the oft-repeated cant that if we grant the vote to woman, it would result in her household duties being neglected. It is surely a transparent and glaring libel on the intelligence of woman to say that in order to fit her for the intelligent recording of her vote once in 3 years, it would be necessary for her to neglect her household duties. Rubbish. Has she not proved herself equal to man in many respects? Physically, she is the weaker of the two, but morally and intellectually, she is man's equal. In deeds of heroism and self-sacrifice, Mr. Speaker, has she not won laurels which will always remain green in the history of the world? In household economy, her equal is not to be found in man, and in political economy, which after all is only an extension of the household economy, she will yet make her mark.
I call on Mr. Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Circumstances have forced women to enter into competition with men. We know that there is a class who encourage women to take the place of men at half a man's wages.
Yes. Shame.
It's a total shame.
Not good enough.
For this reason, half of your ability, sir. For this reason alone, they should have a vote, and I'm sure they would only pledge themselves to such men as would suppress such a state of affairs. Mr. Gilbert stated that women would have to be politically educated before they could exercise the franchise. I do not know what the case might be in other families, but in my own, the women read the newspapers and take a lively interest in politics. Very lively debates. The supporters of the bill were described as extremists and faddists, but I think it is altogether the other way round. Our present civilization demands the recognition of the equal rights of both sexes, especially with regard to the franchise, and I think all honour is due to those faddists who have worked so hard in the cause of adult suffrage. It is time. The political chain which has enslaved women in the past is broken.
I give you the call, Mr. Caldwell.
Mr. Speaker, hitherto women have been fairly well represented by their husbands, brothers and friends, but that is not true representation. Although many women have expressed themselves in favour of the franchise, the majority are half-hearted. But it is felt by myself and others that women who are made the subjects of direct taxation should at least enjoy the same representation that is accorded to them under local government. Yeah. I do not recognise that public opinion has grown in assertiveness on the question since 1885, when Dr. Stirling introduced the first women's suffrage bill. Indeed, during the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a falling off in interest. I have received remonstrances from women whose opinion I respect against advocating female franchise. I am, however, as much in favour of the extension of the franchise to women, and I will vote for it.
I call on Mr. McPherson.
Mr. Speaker, until Mr. Caldwell sat down, I was doubtful whether he would support the bill or not. I'm glad that at last he saw daylight and is prepared to mete out a measure of justice to women. Women should have the franchise because they're entitled to it. I'm sure that Mr. Johnson is a diligent reader of the newspapers, and he must be aware that during the past few years, hardly a paper has been issued without some reference to the matter. I've noticed of late that a great many meetings have been held to consider the matter, and the women not only in the city but in the country are alive to its importance. I do not think it can be argued for a moment that women have not taken sufficient interest in the matter. Mr. Caldwell said there had been a great deal to learn with regard to politics. I grant that, but there's not been any incentive to women to make a study of politics. From their point of view, the study of politics would simply be a pastime, as they have no means of giving practical effect to the views.
Mr. Price.
Mr. Speaker, I have carefully read up the agitation which preceded the attainment of manhood suffrage, and I found that the identical arguments used now against extending the franchise to women were used against men being granted what is essentially their birthright.
Mr. Speaker, in all movements for an extension of freedom to the masses in contradistinction to the classes, similar arguments have been advanced. Mr. Speaker, every great reform had, in its initial stages, been characterised by the privileged classes as dangerous. Mr. Speaker, women do not desire to leave their homes for the atmosphere of the workshop or the factory, but it is the industrial conditions surrounding them which force them to do it. They have now entered so considerably into our industrial life that they have undergone a thoroughly sound preparation for the exercise of the franchise. Mr. Speaker, men speak of women as weak creatures with no will. But my experience is that although I might fancy I get my own way at home, I do not. Mr. Speaker, women can do business and many men cannot. Die and his wife take up the business and conduct it better than he ever did. Mr. Speaker, I have heard some honourable members say they would get into Parliament on their good looks, but they wouldn't. Got into Parliament, they would be better than many of the old women here now.
It is now December. A number of members whose votes are needed for the success of the bill are out sick. Supporters of the bill make very long speeches, stonewalling to prevent a vote being taken while they don't have the numbers for a majority.
Mr. Brooker.
Mr. Speaker, I have heard no substantial reasons advanced as to why the right to vote should not be extended to women. This is accounted for by the fact that the experiment in New Zealand has completely wiped out all of the old arguments which will want to be used against the proposal to give suffrage to women. I have often heard it said, why would you give a vote to the common streetwalker? But nothing is ever mentioned about denying the right to vote to those so-called men who are the cause of our streetwalkers. They were given the vote and no questions were asked. Where is the logic in the thing? It is frequently said that women is the weaker vessel and is not able to fight the battle of life so well as men. I have, however, known women, when men have failed through accident or misfortune, to step into the line of duty and fight the battle of life splendidly. When we consider how women do this work, why should men say that their helpmates shall only help in a certain direction? They would be the very best helpmates in politics.
Well said.
With Mr. Caldwell, this is apparently only a question of business. But with me, a question of humanity comes in. I do not regard it as a question of property.
You do me wrong, sir.
I listened to the honourable member's speech, and if there was ever a speech of a man sitting on the rail, it was that speech. To me, it is a question of right or wrong, and looking at it in every way, we should see that this blot on our discussion shall exist no longer. We shall no longer say that woman is unfit to exercise the franchise. I will not discuss the question of whether women should sit in the House, but I will say that if any intellectual power or force of character of a woman receives the support of any constituency, she should have the perfect right to sit in the House.
The Chair calls Mr. McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some say it is unfair women should not have a voice in politics. But I believe she already has such a voice. Every man. Oh, well, every man has his soft side, and the women of South Australia are clever enough to find it. I believe in the truth that man rules the world and that the woman rules the man. My own experience has shown me that, and undoubtedly women exercise a very considerable influence on their husbands in political matters. If women were to have the franchise, the peace of our homes would be injured by the introduction of political disagreements, and therefore I trust that this measure will not pass. The Premier supports the measure, but I've been married for a longer period. And I know... but I know more about home life than Mr. Kingston. It is much to be regretted that the young men of South Australia do not get married sooner. That is not the case in many instances. I would suggest, as a means of raising revenue and relieving girls from the need to work in factories, that unmarried men over the age of 25 years in South Australia should be taxed.
Order! Order! Mr. Hooper!
Mr. Speaker, I know that a number of the wealthier women of our community have petitioned against the bill. But there are many others who, although they may not be so rich, are as fully entitled to respect.
Yeah. Too much respect for women.
It is an insult to these women to say that the sex as a whole does not desire the franchise. Those who do not want the bill need not vote when the opportunity presents itself, but they should not seek to deprive others of the right of doing so.
Mr. Burgoyne.
Mr. Speaker, I have been listening throughout the debate for some substantial argument against giving this measure of right and justice to the sex whom we all so admire and esteem. Mr. Gilbert said that a vote should not be given to women because they are imperfectly educated in political matters. On that principle, we should deny the right to a large number of our own sex. And possibly some members of Parliament are imperfectly educated in political matters. Dear me. Opportunities must be given to women to educate themselves, and the best opportunity is the performance of the duties which would devolve upon them through having the right to vote. Some member said that a majority of women have not asked for the privilege. We claim to have advanced in our views during the last 30 or 40 years, but Mr. Gilbert, in this respect, has not advanced as far as the founders of the colony, who in its constitution provided for manhood suffrage. At that time, a large majority were silent on the matter. But because even a few asked for it, it was given. Mr. McLaughlin said that woman has now a voice in the elections because she can advise those who vote. Let him apply it to his own case. If he was not allowed to vote, but simply allowed to advise others how they should vote, would he be satisfied? I think not.
One and not the other.
And this being the case, I would recommend the old rule of doing to others what we would like done to us.
Indeed.
The bachelor tax proposed by Mr. McLaughlin is an outrageous suggestion. I have heard of a tax on wealth and on certain privileges, but to tax a man on his greatest misfortune seems to me to be an unchristian suggestion.
We call on Mr. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For some time past, I have been somewhat exercised as to how I will vote on this question, as although I promised on the hustings that if the measure was introduced I would support it, yet lately I have received letters from several of my constituents asking me to oppose it to the best of my power. Well,
Gentleman is entitled to be heard in silence.
Mr. Solomon, would you like a throat lozenge?
Or just a throat removed.
And so some of them have urged me to stick to the promises I made on the hustings. The district of Gumaraka is about equally divided in opinion on this question, so I see that it is quite out of the question to please all. So I have made up my mind to stick to my promises. And my intention is to vote with the government. With the women, so far as exercising the franchise is concerned, are placed in the same category as lunatics, idiots and criminals. A state of things which I think would be unmanly and unjust for us to allow to be continued any longer. I see women working and helping men pretty well in every employment that he is engaged in fields, gardens, factories, vineyards, shops, telegraphs, post office, and they continue to find time to attend tea fights, shows, concerts, lectures, theatres and entertainments of all kinds. Can she not therefore be spared from her home for 1 hour or more once in 2 or 3 years to record her voice for the choice of those representatives who are to frame the laws under which she is to live and be governed? Mr. Speaker, it is true that a large number of women are indifferent and don't care much whether they get the vote or not. But this is not to be wondered at when we consider that by her education and her environments for generations past, she has been led to believe that she could not understand politics and that it was unwomanly for her to take any part in such matters. Given women the opportunity, and they would soon wake up to their privileges and responsibilities, and the apathy that might be apparent at first would quickly pass away. Mr. Speaker, regarding the sentimental aspect of the question, I would ask who has been our best friends from the hour of our births to the present? Has it not been the kind and good woman who have been our trusted sympathisers and comforters in times of trouble and disaster? Again, the kind and good woman. Yes, these are the good creatures to whom the opponents of this measure practically say, you may do this and as much more as you like, but you shall not have the vote. It is not ungrateful, it is selfish and unjust.
Order! the Honourable Mr Archibald.
Mr. Speaker, whenever the question of woman suffrage is before us, there is a tendency on the part of those opposed to the principle to try and prove that women are angels, whilst men are just the reverse. I do not think there is anything to be gained by that sort of sentimental nonsense, and it would be just as well if members debated in an intelligent manner.
Not that
And left poetic flights of imagination severely alone. I am inclined to believe that women are very similar to men. There are good and bad women, and there are good and bad men. The world will not be turned upside down when the franchise is granted to women as some people contend. Legislation will be as safe in the hands of women as it has been in their male relations up to the present time.
Mr Foster.
Mr Speaker, the same objections as to extending the franchise could have been made against giving it to the man over 21. Probably the man over 21, when he first received the suffrage, was not as well educated as the woman of today. I do not agree with the statement that woman is generally without interest in political affairs. Would a mother, the head of a household, who remembers that the well-being of her children depends on the well-being of the national life, be indifferent to political matters? If that right were granted, which has been so unfairly denied them, they would soon come forward and take their share of responsibility. Woman has now come to take her part in the battle of life. And things have changed greatly of late. New Zealand has led the way. But I hope that South Australia will be second in the matter.
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, we will all be gone shortly. And who is it that will have most to do with the making of the future? Why, those who have most to do with the moulding of the youth of today, who will be the men and women of the time shortly to come. If, therefore, that influence, when exerted indirectly, has been beneficial, might we not anticipate that the influence of these same women, used under similar circumstances but with greater freedom, would result in greater good?
Yes.
Yes, it would. I'm sure that although we widen the scope of women's influence, we would not lessen the power for good she has shown in her present sphere.
It will.
Does Mr Solomon pretend that because women have voted for mayor, aldermen and councillors, it has weakened her influence at home?
Those women who voted were only taxpayers and property holders.
Does Mr Speaker, does he pretend that women with property might exercise the franchise without injuring their home influence, but that women without property could not? It matters not whether we look at it from a political, a social or a moral point of view. There appears no logical argument against extending to women that which we have extended to all men.
Several days later, there is great excitement in the House of Assembly. The members who were sick are back, and the government believes it has enough supporters present to get the bill through. When debate begins, the gallery is packed with women eager to see the bill pass. The opposition, however, is determined to stonewall. They bore on until after dinner, waiting for old, frail George Hawker to tire and for the government's numbers to dwindle.
We recognise you, Mr MacDonald.
Mr Speaker, I think that the opponents of the measure have only been stonewalling it up to the present time. In advocating for the suffrage, I consider that we are perfectly safe and that nothing but good would result from handing over the right to vote to the women. The same old arguments and the same old story are used time after time by the opponents of the bill.
Because it's true.
I intend to introduce a clause preventing women from sitting in Parliament. Women would aspire to the seat of Parliament, but I do not think they should have it just yet. The House is not a proper sphere for women. All the Australian colonies are pledged to the measure, which should be passed without delay.
Mr. Landseer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Amongst the ladies with whom I am acquainted, there is no desire that the bill should be passed. They have confidence in their husbands and brothers to see that nothing is done to oppress women, and they feel that the government of the state might well be left in their hands. They also point out that the position of women is now altogether different to that of 50 years ago. And without the extension of the present franchise, I have faith that those who come after us would only be too anxious to afford women that protection and care which any motherly woman could desire. Domestic happiness is the most important thing to us all. And I fear opportunities would crop up for disturbing domestic quietude if the bill was passed. Women hold very strong views on elections, and they would then be able to express those strong views. On the other hand, husbands and sons might be particularly interested in the return of Mr. So-and-so, and if the lady of the house endorsed their choice, all would be well. But if the mother held other views, she would have an opportunity of tutoring her daughters in her ideas. Later on, the husband and brothers might have their suspicions of how the womenkind have voted, and they would put the question straight. The women would then either have to admit that they voted in opposition to the men, or they would have to adopt a system of duplicity. I am merely placing my views honestly on record. Women's influence is greater today than if the bill passed.
It's not a question of influence, but of right.
My own views on right differ from those of the honourable member. Adam and Samson and Anthony were all led astray by the wiles of beautiful women who proved how great women's influence. I hope the bill will not pass.
When members are willing to listen, I will call Mr. Riddick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Men are no doubt much better than women in their reasoning faculties. Although women excel in the perceptive, and we must remember that women are frequently influenced by the good looks and manners of men rather than by their true character. That is a danger that is bound to exist in the case of elections. We are told that in Wyoming, one of the results of women's suffrage was that the best-dressed men are returned to the legislature. Captain Randall's description of the care bestowed by women upon mankind from the cradle to the grave was quite poetic, and I'm quite with him on realising the obligations we are under to the sex. But because I feel that nature intended women to fulfil the duties so well described by that member, and that there would be a risk of them becoming less womanly, I oppose the franchise being forced on them. Those who claim that women's influence would be good on account of her greater refinement of feeling should remember that the contract with grosser men necessary to qualify herself to exercise her right to vote would rob her of this refinement she now has, so that her power for good in that way would be non-existent. All that could be desired can be brought about by the exercise of the influence they now possess, all true men being quite ready to grant everything that is fair to women. Few men appreciate a true woman more than I do. But I feel that in resisting this measure, as I do with all my might, I am doing womankind the best service in my power. And I feel that the time is not too distant. The time is not too distant when they will feel grateful to those who opposed this measure. We know that women are more easily excited, and when excited, they go to greater lengths than men, and it should be our duty to spare them as much as possible. Mr. Speaker, the political disabilities that women labour under are more imaginary than real. Members who say that it is necessary for women to have the vote and the right to sit in Parliament to ensure justice being done to them passes a vote of censure upon themselves.
I now call Mr. Edward Hawker.
Mr. Speaker, it was urged that the vote should be granted to woman so as to enable her to have her wants attended to. That I do not know what wants have not been attended to. Mr. Speaker, we have already brought the Women's Property Act, and I feel gratified that I had the honour to bring to the House a bill which gave the widow the same right to be a guardian of her children as is possessed by the widower. The bill under discussion is like a good many more measures. It was simply introduced because some member thought it should be introduced, and not because there is any demand for it. I have asked various members if their wives are in favour of it, and they replied they did not believe their wives favoured of it. One member said his wife has learned to be in favour of it. This question has never been submitted to the people, and at the last election was treated rather as a joke. Mr. Speaker, some members who would like to vote against this bill are afraid to do so. In New Zealand, some members lost their seats because they had opposed women's suffrage, and others because they didn't come up to the moral standard. Thank you, Solomon. Mr. Speaker, the extension of the suffrage to men was given on the ground that it was due to them as a great unrepresented class. Women, however, are not a class, but a sex, and their interests are identical to those of their menfolk. Mr. Speaker, the position of women is nearly as good as that of man. They can enter the medical profession, and I'm only surprised that they've not been permitted to enter the legal profession. They're admitted into all offices and all trades. Mr. Speaker, I have heard the opinion expressed by more than one able man that women's suffrage would lead to the doing away of the marriage tie. When I mentioned that to one of the ablest advocates of the measure in the colony, he replied, "What of that? When we find men advocating a movement like that and believing that no harm, but perhaps good, would result from doing away with the marriage tie, there must be something radically wrong with the movement." Well, how many men would dare to say it publicly? If we give women the vote, we wish them to exercise it after proper education. The majority of women are poor in this colony, and they're taken up by household duties. And I do not think their little leisure time should be spent in reading up on politics. Mr. Speaker. Men, on the other hand, we work together and so meet and talk over political matters. Either the women would follow the men, or if the women voted away from the men, family jars would ensue.
Order. The chair recognises Mr. Homburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Undoubtedly, this measure would act very unfairly in country districts where people have to go for long distances to record their votes. A man often has to travel as much as 5 or 10 miles. And if he had to take his wife as well, that would cause much trouble. The question then arises, could women forsake their domestic duties and the whole of the family drive 10 miles to the polling booth and leave the farm to take care of itself? In Adelaide, it would not be difficult for a woman to get someone to take charge of her children during the few minutes it takes to record her vote. But in the country, it means a whole day. Consequently, the votes of the farmers' wives would be absolutely lost.
It's 8:10 p.m. The stonewalling continues. Viben Solomon is about to rise and argue against the bill for nearly 3 hours. This has been redacted for your benefit. Gradually, the women who had come with such high hopes leave in disgust.
I believe Mr. Solomon is going to stand.
I could not be seen, Your Honourable Speaker.
Order! Order! I ask members to give Mr. Solomon the respect he deserves.
I deserve respect!
Order! The chair recognises Mr. Solomon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would any honourable member say that the woman he meets day by day want the suffrage? It is advocated by a lot of faddists. The best women are the wives and mothers. I would like to see what sort of homes those are in which the mother gives political instruction to their children. It is more likely to introduce discord into the home. If we had women's suffrage 10 times over, we would not get a body of men in Parliament who would not prove more earnest, honest, and true in their desire to do what is right in relation to their womankind that we have at the present time. That men should preach such twaddle on platforms is an insult to every man in this house. We might perhaps get men elected who would sacrifice all question of what is best for the community, for financial prosperity and the well-being of producers, for such some fad as in the abolition of public houses, or the direct veto. Some oily-tongued old woman of that sort would be returned to the House, no doubt. I have little doubt that the gentler sex could easily be talked over by a glib tongue, a smooth face, and an air of piety would vote for such people. It would not be on my account of supporting the direct veto. I would vote with the government if they would give women if they give women to the vote who have no protectors, earn their own living, and are taxpayers. Women who are fairly and honestly represented by their husbands do not want it, do not ask for it, and have no right to it. Looking around among the happy homes I have been privileged to visit, I've asked the wives and daughters if they want the vote, and they have said they do not. I have not been in the members' home, but I would be pleased to visit it, and I might find out the folk there that they differ from Mr. Woods. The most lovable women and the most devoted to their husbands and their children do not want the vote!
Solomon sits down. A lot of members have left for the evening. One of the opposition has passed Solomon a note to say that only 27 supporters are present. The lukewarm James Howe has stepped out. "28 is the required majority. There is only one woman left in the gallery to see what follows next."
The question is that the bill now be read a second time. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. No. I think the ayes have it. Division is called. Ring the bells.
To the opposition's chagrin, James Howe reappears. Some say Howe came back because the government members stopped him leaving. Others say that he met an acquaintance in the corridor, stopped for a chat, and then had to go back when the division bells rang.
Time has expired. Locked the doors. The question is that the bill be read a second time. The ayes will move to the right of the chair. The noes will move to the left of the chair. I appoint the Minister for Education, the teller for the ayes, and Mr. Solomon as the teller for the noes. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. The result of the division being ayes 28 and noes 12. Order! 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 The bill has been read a second time. Thank you, Mr. Clerk.
In committee on December 17, the opponents try to make amendments to the bill. All amendments fail except one to allow women to vote in absentee. That same evening, the Minister of Education moves a third reading. At 9:30 p.m, a crowd of women who'd been celebrating the return of Catherine Helen Spence in a Rundle Street cafe walked down to Parliament House to watch what they'd hoped would be the passing of the third reading. They were disappointed. The opposition prolonged debate until midnight. 3 supporters of the bill got bored and went home. The government lost the numbers and the House adjourned. On December 18 at 10:30 a.m, the House meets and, after a brief delay to give some tardy members a chance to turn up, the bill is read a third time.
Minister for Education.
I move the bill be read a third time.
Mr. Solomon.
Mr. Speaker, I regret for the credit of the colony that such a measure has been passed. It will delay federation by at least 20 years. By this bill, we place another barrier to the uniform system of electing the representatives of the various colonies.
The chair recognises Mr Granger.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The carrying of the bill means farewell to federation. As the colonies of New South Wales and Victoria are not such idiots as to adopt female suffrage. It is not likely that two colonies with such pluck and energy as these would join an emasculated colony like South Australia.
Mr Hourahan. Mr Hourahan, you have the floor.
Mr Speaker, it has been said that if we give women a vote, it would lead to quarrels and destroy the sanctity of the home. That is about one of the weakest arguments that could be used against the bill. I would remind members of the domestic life of no less a person than the Queen of England and her late husband. We hear nothing of the political duties of the Queen interfering with the sanctity of the home, and yet she presides over the destinies of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Surely, if a woman was able to fulfill all these duties without any friction in her domestic life, it is not too much to say that the women of South Australia could go to the poll once in 3 years and record their votes without any disastrous consequences arising in the domestic circle. Mr Speaker, there is nothing in the argument that women have hitherto taken but little interest in politics, because I maintain that some of the noblest and most self-sacrificing women in South Australia are leading the van for the political emancipation of their sex. Why is it that the great majority of women have not taken a greater interest in politics? It is simply because, for thousands of years, the sex has been treated as if women are little better than serfs. Woman has been made to believe that her principal duty in life is to make herself pleasing to her husband, to cook his food, wash his clothes, mend his socks and bear him children. When one thinks of the treatment women have been subjected to in the past, it is too revolting for one to speak about with calmness. Thanks to the spread of education, we are beginning to realize the fact that a woman has a perfect right to every political privilege possessed by man. Are we to believe that thousands of cultivated women have a worse claim than the rudest and most ignorant of men? Simply because, through the accident of birth, they were born women? Should a son have more rights than his mother, from whom, perchance, he has inherited his best qualities? Common sense and common justice answer no.
Mr Butler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I wish to reply shortly to some of the washy and silly arguments used by Mr Solomon. And had the influence of women been as great on Mr Solomon as it had been on myself, he would be a much better man. Indeed. The honourable member is excessively rude as usual. Mr Solomon wasted more time than any other member. And when anyone else spoke who did not agree with him, he began making silly interjections, which are as meaningless as they are insulting. Mr. Solomon has said that the bill would slow federation, but I would point out that some of the leading statesmen in the colonies, including the Premier of Victoria and Sir Henry Parkes, have declared in favour of women's suffrage.
I see Mr. Griffiths on his feet. Mr. Griffiths.
Mr. Speaker, I compliment the last speaker on his piece of stonewalling, undertaken to keep the ball rolling until the ministry had their number in the House. The result, which is now a foregone conclusion, is due to the twisting and turning of some of the political jugglers who are absolutely insincere. Personal interest is at the bottom of most of the voting for the bill. Before voting for the third reading, I hope members will review the position and not support the bill for the sake of satisfying morbid curiosity.
The question is that the bill now be read a third time. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The motion is carried. Division is called. Ring the bells. Time has expired. Lock the doors. The question is that the bill be read a third time. The ayes will move to the right of the chair. The noes will move to the left of the chair. I appoint the Minister for Education to teller for the ayes, and perhaps Mr. Griffiths this time as teller for the noes. Before I announce the result, I remind the gallery to contain their emotions, whatever the outcome. The result of the division is that the ayes are 31 and the noes 14. I see it is not the gallery I need to remind of their emotions, rather it's the House. And there being the necessary statutory majority in favour of the bill, the third reading is definitely carried. Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark.
The bill is immediately sent back to the Legislative Council, where the amendment made by the Assembly must be agreed before the bill can finally pass.
A message from the Legislative Council. Mr. Speaker, the Legislative Council has agreed to the bill returned herewith, titled An Act to Amend the Constitution without any amendment.
Queen Victoria completes the final stage, providing her royal assent on the 2nd of February 1895. The first election after women were given the right to vote was held in 1896. The state of parties remained much the same, and the Kingston government was returned for a second term in office. The Bulletin paper reported the alleged shrieking sisterhood didn't shriek to any extent worth mentioning. The woman voter didn't blunder over her ballot paper much more than the average male. In short, nothing happened as it was expected to happen. Elizabeth Webb Nichols, key suffragist and president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, remarked, "We have not heard of any domestic quarrels or any neglected children as a result of the new departure. And the dinner was cooked on election day, much the same as usual."
Ladies and gentlemen, we have indeed witnessed history here tonight, and it's just as well it's finished. I'm not sure the heritage furniture could have taken much more. I want to thank everyone in the audience for watching and all those who have participated in the reenactment. Thank you to the cast, many of whom volunteered their time, and to Dr. Nikki Vincent for volunteering her time to narrate the debates. Nikki's narration was guided from the State History Research Centre paper prepared by Pat Stretton and Catherine Gargett. Thank you to several providers who supported this project, including Orangi Creative, Aspect Photography, the State Theatre Company, Violet Rowe Hire, Heather Jones, the Adelaide Costume Shop, Jill Bartlett, and Josh Van Konderkielenberg and Kojo. Thank you to the Hansard people for supporting the recording and streaming capabilities, and to the creative team who planned the reenactment, including Simon Langthione, Emma Johnson, Kate O'Donnell, Lauren Williams, Meredith Brown, Alex Harrigan, and Natalie Young. Hear, hear. Thanks also must go to the clerks and the presiding officers of the House Assembly and the Legislative Council for supporting and, most importantly, funding this reenactment. I must also acknowledge the members of the Joint Committee on the 125th anniversary of women's suffrage for their work and recommendations to the Parliament, and acknowledge the role of the Premier and his support in making such a special year as special as it has been. Thank you, Mr. Premier. Our collective desires are that everyone will be inspired to celebrate and also continually reflect on South Australia's achievements in women's equality, and to appreciate why our amazing suffragists wanted the vote and the good blokes who supported them. The cause, like the women, really owe a good deal to the great blokes. Like them, we must always value the power of the vote and what it can achieve in a participatory democracy. In closing, I would like to again express gratitude to those in the galleries of this chamber for being part of this historic occasion, and also to those watching at home in the virtual galleries. Whoever said Hansard wasn't exciting? We look forward to sharing a recording of this reenactment for use as an ongoing resource in the new year. Honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, the House stands adjourned.